Hello, I'm Jonasz Rawiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. On this episode, we look at a tiny country with a very big target on its back, Moldova. As Chișinău pushes closer to the west, the Kremlin is ramping up disinformation, political subversion and threats from its frozen outpost in Transnistria. But the real question is, will the world wake up before Moldova becomes the next Belarus? Moscow can't invade Moldova, but it can poison it. From coup plots to fake biolabs, from peacekeepers to propagandists, Putin's hybrid war is back. And Moldova may be its next front line. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Moldova is becoming one of the focal points of European geopolitics. As Ukraine's only European neighbour other than Belarus that is not in the European Union, it is the most at risk of being overrun by Russian influence. Or worse. Moscow has been hard at work trying to push an anti-EU narrative within the country, something that it has been doing in many other places, but it comes with an additional danger here. The Breakaway Transnistria region between Ukraine and Moldova is basically controlled by Russia, and the Kremlin even has some reported military presence over there. Already the Russians have been spewing bile about these people being mistreated by Western powers, and they're currently more West-aligned Moldova. This sounds familiar, doesn't it?
No one should have any doubts that Russia will adequately respond to any provocations and ensure the protection of its citizens in Transnistria.
While the Russians are expected to intensify their hybrid activities against Moldova in the coming weeks ahead of the September parliamentary elections, observers are fairly certain that they will not be able to deploy enough troops for a military intervention. Either way, the Moldovans must remain vigilant. Russian influence is multi-layered and multifaceted, and while they have the support of Western powers, that alone will not be enough to overcome the Kremlin's long shadow. Nevertheless, statements like these by the European Commission President do help.
Maya, you have said that for Moldova, Europe is a dream that must become a reality. We in the European Union will do all that we can to make your dream come true.
The upcoming elections in Moldova will be pivotal. They will most likely decide whether the country will position itself for further serious EU integration, or whether it will stumble and hang over the chasm that is the so-called Russian world.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Russia's influence stretches far beyond its own borders and takes many different forms. In the case of Moldova, these forms have two names too many: Gagauzia and Transnistria. Here is more.
Transnistria is the more well-known of the two breakaway regions within Moldova's internationally recognized borders. The strip of land between Moldova and Ukraine has had the eyes of many in Ukraine and the EU on it due to the reported presence of Russian soldiers. The region has had a turbulent relationship with Moldova itself, as the two had even fought a war in 1992. The region relies heavily on Russia's support to maintain itself, and its population is predominantly Russian-speaking and pro-Russian. Many observers fear that should Russia successfully conquer the parts of southern Ukraine linking to the region, it could become a staging ground for a further attack against Moldova itself, as it is not an EU member. Gagauzia is the lesser known of the two regions, and is located in southern Moldova. It is primarily home to the Gagauz people, who are a Turkic-speaking Orthodox Christian population. In the early 1990s, the region peacefully negotiated autonomy with Moldova. In 1994, Moldova granted its self-governing status. This means Gagauzia can manage its own economic, cultural and local affairs, while remaining as a part of the wider Moldovan state. Nonetheless, Gagauzia, much like Transnistria, hosts pro-Russian sentiments, and has opposed further integration with the EU on many occasions. It is not seen as a possible location for an immediate Russian military threat, however.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. Tucked between Ukraine and Romania, Moldova has no nuclear arsenal, no military alliances, and almost no global headlines. But it has something Moscow wants desperately to control: narrative, geography, and momentum. As Moldova inches closer to the European Union and its September parliamentary elections draw near, Russia is intensifying its hybrid war campaign to pull the country back into its crumbling sphere of influence. The tanks might be stuck in Ukraine, but the playbook is alive and well in Chișinău: disinformation, destabilization and denial. In early 2023, Moldova's President Maya Sandu revealed Russia had drawn up plans to orchestrate a coup, destabilize the government and install a puppet regime. The blueprint? False flag operations in the breakaway region of Transnistria, complete with provocateurs, saboteurs and protests designed for maximum media effect. Moscow, of course, denied everything, and then promptly began proving it was all true. Fast forward to today, and pro-Russian Moldovan figures like analyst Yuri Vasilievich are parroting Kremlin talking points on cue, accusing Ukraine and NATO of dragging Moldova into a war. It's the same old script: blame the West, claim victimhood, then wreak havoc from within. Russia's obsession with Moldova isn't ideological, it is strategic. In the east, Transnistria, a Soviet zombie state that Russia props up, holds a massive Cold War-era weapons depot in Kolbasna, 20,000 tons of aging munitions that Moscow fears could fall into Ukrainian hands. In the south, Moldova borders Ukraine's vulnerable Odessa region. Controls here means pressure there. And the Kremlin isn't just worried about losing Moldova's territory, it is terrified of losing Moldova's people. Moldovan youth are turning away from Moscow, and even Transnistria's own young men are increasingly uninterested in serving in Moscow's peacekeeping forces. This is why Prime Minister Dorin Recioan's recent speech in Parliament rattled so many cages. His plan? Full demilitarization of Transnistria and the removal of all Russian troops, weapons and influence from Moldovan soil. Moscow's response? Predictable. First, threats. Russia's foreign ministry warned that any move against its troops would be treated as an attack on the Russian Federation. Then, fear-mongering. Russian military pundits floated rumors that Moldova was seeking Ukrainian military support to take Transnistria by force. And finally, the absurd. Russia's now standard claim that Moldova, like Ukraine, is secretly housing American bioweapons labs. It is nonsense, of course, but when Moscow cannot control reality, it tries to discredit it. And yet, Moldova is fighting back. It is restoring bomb shelters, it's reinforcing intelligence cooperation with Ukraine and the European Union, and it's holding firm despite the intimidation, despite the propaganda, and despite the risk. Because Moldova has learned what Ukraine already knows. Russia doesn't win when you stand up to face it. It wins when you turn around. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Kerry Longhurst, Professor of Political Science at the Civitas University. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you.
So let's begin by basically presenting this overall picture of Moldova as a country that is facing quite a few threats and quite a few methods which are being used in order to influence the result of the elections taking place in September. Can you tell us what these methods are?
Well, as you kind of hinted at, it's a real battleground for hybrid warfare. It's a test of the country's own resilience to battle against hybrid warfare emanating from Kremlin and the acolytes. But it's also a real test for the West and the European Union in particular to put together the remedies to counter that. But what is the country up against? Well, what we're seeing are familiar patterns of hybrid warfare, so coming from the Kremlin, which were really at play back in 2024 as well, at the time of the presidential election and the EU referendum.
Well, it's not the first time, right?
No, exactly. In a way, we're kind of braced for these kind of things. But, you know, since the 2024 elections, the Kremlin has become much more focused and more dexterous and more personal in terms of its various hybrid warfare methods. And it's not just about creating telegram channels and peddling false narratives about Europeanisation and the country's EU membership prospects. It includes, obviously, personal attacks upon the current president, upon politicians. So they really have the whole kind of spectrum of different types of hybrid warfare tools.
And how much of a risk are we facing in terms of them possibly succeeding? After all, they came really close with the European referendum, for example.
Yeah, that's right. Last year, even though President Sandu won the election and the country put its back behind EU membership prospects, it was a really slim majority. And so we really should be quite sober and realistic about the possibility of this time around the Russian-backed and Russian-led hybrid warfare tools succeeding. I really don't think we should rule that out, unfortunately.
And so let's start with the political scene, because apparently it's not just openly pro-Russian parties. Russia is also using more insidious methods to try and sway the result of the election in its favour.
I think one of the strongest lines they have, and I think it's potentially very, very effective, is trying to discredit democratisation, trying to discredit the legitimacy of the current government, and also, and this is a really big strategic issue, trying to discredit the country's EU membership prospects. If they succeed at that, if they manage to support a kind of Russian-aligned or pro-Russian or, let's say, less Western parliament in the forthcoming elections in the autumn, they really will succeed at dislodging what is the current strategic direction of the country. And I think it's a real prospect.
But that is, is still, we're talking like, the narrative phase, so to say. But then you actually have all these parties, and some of them are not what they seem, apparently. Can you tell us more about this? Because it's not just Ilan Shor. I mean, he has become something of a household name, at least in discussions concerning Moldova. But he's not alone. There are also some actors who purport to be rather more pro-European. But are they?
Yeah, I think short answer, probably not, but in a way, who knows? These types of politicians are opportunists. They see a gain for themselves in terms of collaborating and promoting openness and keeping the country open to business with Russia. But they would also personally gain from the country joining the European Union. So I think in a way it's hard to pinpoint them or compartmentalise them as purely Russophile or pure kind of pro-EU and pro-Western.
But it's possible, isn't it? I mean, in Georgia, the Georgian Dream Party purported to be pro-European. And to some extent, they would actually use this narrative. I mean, recently they kind of abandoned it, but before that, they said, no, we're pro-Western, totally not pro-Russian.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the scenarios that could well emerge in Moldova this year and after the election if the, let's say, the wrong result comes about. It could be another Georgia-type scenario where you have a government which in some ways talks about Europeanisation. They won't call off the prospect of membership. They won't bring an end to accession prospects, but they will indeed do Russia's bidding and probably return to trading more with Russia. They'll restate energy deals with Russia, for example, and that would indeed be a kind of Georgia-type scenario in Moldova. And that's not totally unlikely, I would say. That might be a best-case scenario because the EU path would be maintained, but it's far from ideal, and it's not what the majority of Moldovans vote for in legitimate terms. And
potentially the dilution of this process could lead to its stalling at some point in the future. Now, you said that, what if we have the wrong scenario from our point of view? But what happens if we have the wrong scenario from the Russian point of view? Could they try and claim that, for example, the election was rigged, or even stage some sort of coup, claiming that this is the popular vote? I mean, again, it's been done before.
I mean, I think for sure a coup may be a bit far-fetched, but certainly if the kind of Western parties or EU-leaning parties end up being a majority again in Parliament, you may well have calls from Russian-supported Moldovan politicians and from the Kremlin itself about the lack of legitimacy of the forthcoming election. But I think what is really the big question right now is the extent to which Russia is going to back certain, potential parliamentarians between now and the election, and the variety. We can guarantee there's going to be a variety of types of hybrid warfare tools used between now and the election in September, and that is the critical issue to really look at, I would say.
So first, they will be throwing money at not just the pro-Russian politicians there, but also at voters, right? I mean, again, they already did that in the most recent elections.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes from really crude tools, literally paying or bribing voters to vote a certain way, from intimidating, from bussing in voters to vote for a certain party. So we already know that that goes on, and we know that it was very effective. You know, the election last year, the presidential election and the EU referendum, these were indisputably affected by Russian interference. So for sure that's going to happen again, because the West didn't get its act together and didn't call this out loudly enough. So for sure it's going to emerge. So we'll see that type of interference for sure. But I think what will also occur is that Russia will campaign and lead via social media a narrative that will challenge the European membership path of the country, but also they will suggest that the current leadership is leading the country to war. For sure, and that's a really powerful narrative, and of course it's going to make people think about who they're going to vote for, what's safe for the country.
And they have the means to promote these narratives. Wouldn't you say that this is a major vulnerability, that, Russian media is still present, and also there are people who genuinely believe what is being said there, not just in Transnistria or Gagauzia, other regions as well?
Absolutely, the whole country, I think there's as many other countries, Moldova isn't alone in this respect, but there really is a vulnerability to these types of overtures. Moldovan identity, not just my view, but broadly speaking, is quite fractured and quite fragile in many ways. And that really does leave the population open to these types of pro-Russian or kind of vague overtures, putting seeds of doubt into people's minds. So there really is it's a real test bed for the impact of Russian narratives, and therefore, how far the West can really overcome and challenge, and how robust the population really is to overcome and to, see the nuance rather than the simple messaging that the Kremlin tends to push.
Because the government in Chișinău has been fairly robust so far. I mean, some of the political parties that are openly pro-Russian were banned, and they're also trying to reduce the scope of influence of Russian state media, but you still have social media influence. Apparently, TikTok campaigns in particular are particularly effective when it comes to spreading these Russian narratives. So, would you say that this is going to be efficient enough to make a dent in Moscow's plans? And also, what if the government is resilient but the public is not?
Yeah, there's lots of really important issues there. I think first and foremost, there are gaps in, I think, the public's knowledge about European integration and the potential benefits for the country, and this also kind of leaves a gap for Russian interference. And one of the problems is that it's hard to regulate social media. There's a fine line, obviously, as you know, there's a fine line between freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, but also controlling, lies and misleading narratives. And Moldova, like many countries, hasn't really been able to, navigate that fine line. And again, this is in the favour, I would say, of Russian narratives, which will always find a way through into getting the message across. And you're right, I mean, the government and a substantial number of parliamentarians are overtly pro-EU, kind of pro-Western, and they want to see the country join with Western institutions, but there's still a large part of the parliament, and that could grow after September, and a large portion of the population who would rather see a form of neutrality in the country, or who would rather also keep the country open for business with the EU, but also with Russia and the CIS more broadly as well.
So if you don't be dragged into the war and the narrative. We've seen that in Romania. Do you think that it could play out similarly, like with Mr. Georgescu and the whole election debacle and the rerun and all that?
I think we can't rule it out, not least because Moldova's electoral institutions are still fairly fragile. The West tries to kind of monitor and support the strengthening of electoral procedures, but there's still lots of vulnerabilities there. And like I said, social media as part of the campaigning trail, which is already in motion, isn't very well regulated. And so that kind of scenario, those ingredients, make the next election quite a fragile context and difficult to predict. I'm a mixture of optimistic and also pessimistic. I'm realistic.
Professor Kerry Longhurst was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Ukrainian intelligence says that Russia's advanced ballistic missile arsenal has shrunk by nearly 50% since May. This depletion apparently concerns the Iskander-M and North Korean-supplied KN-23 missiles.
Russia's near-constant attacks on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure have exacted a toll on its missile supplies. According to Ukrainian intelligence, Moscow's domestic stockpile of advanced ballistic missiles has dropped from 580 to just 300 since May 2025. This latest report from Kiev does not include other types of Russian missiles that Moscow has been using against Ukraine, such as the S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missiles that have been repurposed for ground attacks. The data also does not include the Kinzhal model, which is an air-launched variant of the Iskander-M. Reports indicate that Russia currently has more than 60 tactical missile launch systems deployed close to Ukraine's borders. This means that despite the stockpile's depletion, Russia is hell-bent on continuing its missile strikes.
The city of Mariupol and the Azovstal steel plant in particular have become symbols of Ukrainian defiance against Russia. Now, however, Moscow seeks to convert the steel plant into a military facility.
Symbolism and its importance is not something that has historically been lost on the minds of the Kremlin's leaders. The Ukrainian Independent Information Agency says that Moscow has been busy transforming parts of occupied Ukrainian cities into military bases to facilitate its war against Ukraine. Mariupol, the symbol of Russian savagery and brutality, is one such city. The Russian army has reportedly established 2 military bases at the Azovstal steel plant, the very same site where thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians held out against Russian attacks in the early months of the war. What's more, these 2 bases were created fairly recently, just 2 months ago. This means that Russia is interested in Mariupol not just as an infrastructure crossroads and key port, but also as an important point for full-scale military logistics.
Russia and Belarus are committed to working together in every possible way. This time the dastardly duo is looking to conquer the realm of cyberspace.
Russia and Belarus have been behind when it comes to developing AI models and systems. This is mainly due to the sanctions imposed on them by the West. Yet now they seem to finally have come around to the idea that investing in this technology is important, with their own peculiar twist. Belarus's state agency says that Moscow and Minsk will work together to develop an artificial intelligence system that officials have called grounded in traditional values. Of course, no one knows what these traditional values actually are in the eyes of these 2 countries. The Secretary of the Union State of Russia and Belarus has revealed, however, that the country's younger generations, in his view, are becoming increasingly vulnerable to being manipulated by foreign-made AI models. This new system is apparently meant to counteract this supposed threat, while also proving Russia and Belarus's independence from Western technology.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.